Welcome to Leadership for Equality by UNESCO and the associated country Women of the World. It's a podcast to explore the personal and professional experiences of women around the world and to discuss the opportunities, challenges, obstacles, and successes on their journeys.
We'll be asking our guests what leadership means to them and ask them to share their stories and ideas that will inspire more women to embrace leadership and be embraced as leaders.
We are your hosts. I am Garance Sarlat.
And I'm Nick Newland. In this episode, women thought leaders will discuss leadership and gender and give us insightful analysis of how philosophy can disturb and question gendered norms and narratives in women's empowerment. I'm delighted to introduce our first guest, Nastassja Pugliese. She is a philosopher, assistant professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where she coordinates the UNESCO Chair for the History of Women in Philosophy, Sciences and Cultures. This academic position especially focuses on the rescue of philosophical works written by women thought leaders.
Nastassja, it is a pleasure to welcome you to our podcast. I would like to ask you for the very first question, the same that we will ask all of our interviewees today. How do you define leadership? And how does this connect to the topic that brought us today, which is gender equality?
So thank you for having me here. It's my pleasure. So one of the most traditional goals of philosophy, the one that has been the focus of the traditional classical ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, is the search for a good definition. What is X? What is this thing? So what is a good leader is a perfectly good, genuine philosophical question. And I allow myself to sort of sketch a definition without appealing to the authority of former philosophers. And then later I'll bring them to the narrative, okay? So I think that a leader is someone who inspires others to take action. It is someone who is an example of strength, of virtues, of righteousness, of ethics. And by holding these characteristics through and expressing them through his or her actions, a leader can guide, can foster transformations, can bind people together towards a common goal. A good leader never overshadows the power of acting of another, but connects actors, develops the capacity of the group to think as a collective, enhancing, facilitating, creating conditions for the others to flourish, right? For this reason, a good leader never acts alone, because she sort of moves the engines of actions in others, right? Like Angela Davis, for example, she's a leader. And she says something like, when a Black woman moves, the whole social structure moves with her. And I think that this is the core idea behind leadership. When you move, you set others in motion, no matter whether you are in a recognized position of power or not. And this has everything to do with gender equality. We have all heard about the Caesar effect, the leaky pipeline, or glass ceiling in academia. That is, when you look at the numbers of women on the entry point of the academic career in undergraduate courses, and especially in philosophy and STEM, and we follow the academic ladder up to the highest point in the career, right? Which some consider this point to be that of a professor researcher or as the president of a university, right? We see a drop, a very large decrease in the number of women in positions of power in education. And the reasons behind this phenomena are various, including the toll, for example, of parenting and motherhood in female academics, the lack of public policies for their performance in academia, right? But this is true in all other areas of life. The number of women in parliament or in politics, for example. There is an absurd story to be told. So until the end of 2015, the Brazilian Senate did not have a female toilet in the House. So women senators had to walk outside to use a restaurant's toilet that was nearby. So the number of women senators were so small that it sort of didn't justify having a female restroom in the building. So gender equality is not only like having more women in positions of power, but it also about having the conditions for the flourishing of half of the world's population. It is about creating public policies that help construct a social environment where women are treated with respect, with no violence, and where women and girls are surrounded by expectations for their own success. So it is like a double challenge. Break the glass ceiling, but also occupy the social imaginary as leaders in government, in sciences, in academia, in the economic sector. It is about like a practical change, but also about imagining a public role for women, a role that goes beyond the traditional gender roles of the household as mothers and wives.
Looking to the future of our imagination, the future of the role of women in academia, in politics, the economy, can we go back to the past? Tell us what your work is about. Explain to us how, through recognising that women have had their work appropriated by men, very often without credit, we can reshape our understanding of philosophical tradition. Tell us how shedding light on hidden figures really makes a difference.
What I like to say is that the Retrieval Project, which is this project of going to the archives, to the libraries, finding manuscripts, first editions of works, correspondence of women in philosophy, it shows that women have always practiced philosophy, right? So when we reconstruct the history of philosophy from the perspective of women's production, we are not creating names, inventing new characters. These works exist and they are there, and they're forgotten and neglected in libraries. So I think it's very important to start answering this question by saying that these women philosophers have always existed. Women have always practiced philosophy, engaged in philosophical conversation with others, right? Even great canonical philosophers that we know of. So I think this work implies two different things. So the fact that there exist women philosophers is a matter of fact, right? So they are there, and it's up to us to go study their work and promote their ideas. But it's also a matter of right. Um, so this kind of work is a work that allows us to understand more about our own cultural heritage and the legacy that other women intellectuals have left us. And I always like to quote Professor Ruth Hagengruber. She says that the neglect and the erasure of women's contribution to our intellectual past uh, contributes for us, for women, not to have a collective memory, a memory about the legacy that other women had produced. So this means that it is as if we have been stripped of our contributions to the sciences and to the history of ideas. And this influences the way that today we see ourselves as women. So when we do this retrieval work, we are also doing a work on collective memory, sort of bringing back the contribution of women philosophers, makes us think of ourselves today, and the new generation will be able to think of themselves today as thinkers, as producers of science, as intellectuals, right? So it is about giving back an identity, giving back the dignity of women, right? Giving back the dignity to women, the dignity of being a thinker, an autonomous thinker. With respect to how the Retrieval Project informs the contemporary discussions on gender and leadership, I have an example. So if we take the history of political thought, right, the history of republicanism, um, various other interesting intellectuals like Sandrine Berger, Karen Green, and Jacqueline Broad, they have shown that the history of republicanism is masculinist, in the sense that the leaders have been thought what has been considered to be a good leader in the republic tradition was the person who had male characteristics, right? So the virtues of the leaders have been considered to be male virtues. So classical Republican theorists like Livy or Cicero, they excluded women from full citizenship by characterizing this ideal citizen as male. And we can also see Machiavelli, right? How he built on this tradition by arguing that the ideal citizen was expected to be virile, to avoid passivity, to avoid dependence, and not to lack in self determination, right? So the man of virtue was bold, brave, active, self reliant. And then, in this sense, women, given that until the early 19th century, women couldn't participate in the public sphere, they were excluded from civic virtue and active political participation. So when we consider the production of the political thought that has been produced by women, we see a change in the way that the leaders, the main characteristics of a good leader has been thought.
Going back to something you said right at the start, you've implemented within the Federal University the idea of a feminist pedagogy. Can you explain to our listeners why that's so important for leadership?
My call is a call for curriculum development, right? That when if we want to reach equally all the students, if we want to be true to the principle that women have the same right as men to access the best possible education and educational opportunities, right? We have to make sure we include the contribution of women scientists, women philosophers, and cultural figures in our narratives whenever we are teaching any kind of content, right? So that's basically the idea that there is a gender power dynamics that influence the classroom environment and the knowledge acquisition, and that this gender power dynamics can be lessened. This influence can be less obnoxious on women if we rethink the narrative that we offer inside the classroom. So we should think about our syllabi, we should think about our curriculum, we should think about the expectations that we are unwillingly creating on girls and on women whenever we are teaching any kind of class. So that's the core idea of the feminist pedagogy, showing new role models, diversifying the syllabus, right? Creating new narratives that allow women and girls to imagine again themselves as a future mathematician, right? So that's the idea behind feminist pedagogy, that we can change this power dynamics that is noxious inside the classroom when we become aware that this affects negatively the learning of our students.
Thank you, Natasha. This was brilliant. I am pleased to introduce our next guest, Kathryn Sophia Belle, a philosopher from the Pennsylvania State University. She is the founder of the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers and the founder and owner of La Belle Vie Academy.
Kathryn, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. I wanted to ask you, what does leadership mean to you? And can you tell us, is it a proper philosophical concept, or is this just a notion that we talk about?
Hello, thank you for so much for having me. So when I think of leadership, what immediately comes to my mind is Mary Church Terrell's framework of lifting as we climb. So in an 1898 address before the American Women's Suffrage Association, Terrell takes up enfranchisement for Black women, and she concludes her remarks there by saying, "And so, lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go, struggling and striving and hoping that the buds and blossoms of our desires will burst into glorious fruition ere long, with courage born of success achieved in the past, with a keen sense of the responsibility we shall continue to assume. We look forward to a future large with promise and hope," right? So there's this notion of lifting as we climb that we get out of the Black women's suffrage movement and activism from that era until today. For me, leadership is also about celebrating the power and strength of difference and interdependence. And it is about encouraging and empowering people to flow in and leverage their strengths, both for themselves as well as for the good of the whole, right? So leadership is about showing as well as telling. And what I mean by that is leading both by example and by instruction, or leading by what we say as well as by what we do. So in my own life, I've demonstrated leadership largely through my academic initiatives and endeavors, from founding the Ida B. Wells Philosophical Forum as a graduate student, to founding the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers as an assistant professor, to being a co-founder of the journal Critical Philosophy of Race, to founding my own academy, La Belle Vie Academy, which has signature programs and course suites and community for high achievers, happily unmarried, erotic empowerment, and now exit strategies. In terms of whether or not leadership is a proper philosophical concept or a notion, to be honest, I think anything can be a philosophical concept, right? So if pre-Socratic Thales' fragment with the word water constitutes the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition, as is often taught in history of philosophy courses, then to me, the bar is actually pretty low for what counts as philosophy or as a philosophical concept, right? So when I was teaching history of philosophy courses, I always started with Egyptian and Chinese philosophy because chronologically they actually came before Greek philosophy. And of course, it's been argued that much of what we now consider Greek philosophy was taken from Egyptian philosophy. So you could see, for example, Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James or Black Athena by Martin Bernal on that connection between Egyptian and Greek philosophy.
Kathryn, I think I'd like for you to tell us more about how those different areas of study inform our understanding of gender, leadership, race, how those intersect, and how those are shaping challenges, opportunities, and experiences of leadership.
My areas of specialization within philosophy include African American and Africana philosophy, Black feminist philosophy, continental philosophy, especially existentialism, as well as critical philosophy of race and social and political philosophy. So when I look at like my first two books, for example, my first two books are on probably the most well-known women philosophers, namely Hannah Arendt and Simone de Beauvoir. So my first book on Arendt is Hannah Arendt and the Negro Question, which was published in 2014 and had a French translation in 2023. And then my most recent book is Beauvoir and Belle, A Black Feminist Critique of the Second Sex, which is published with Oxford University Press this year in 2024. Now, what's interesting to me about these two women philosophers is that both Arendt and Beauvoir are actually leaders in philosophy, right? They were academically trained in philosophy. They earned advanced degrees in philosophy, but they both rejected the label of philosopher, right? So Arendt preferred to be called a political theorist, and Beauvoir preferred to describe herself as a writer. And I think this says a lot about how philosophy has treated women in general, and professional and academic philosophy has been even more problematic when it comes to the treatment of Black women in particular. So, for example, the first Black woman to earn a PhD in philosophy was Joyce Mitchell Cook, who earned her PhD from Yale University in 1965. But ultimately, she left the academy altogether, right? So academia was hostile to her brilliance and her leadership. So she took her brilliance and her leadership elsewhere, ultimately going to the White House and becoming a speech writer during the Johnson administration and doing other political work, right? So my studies, as well as my lived experience, have shown me that Black women and other women of color are actually amazing leaders. Nonetheless, at one end of the spectrum, we're often presumed incompetent, as examined in, there's a book actually called Presumed Incompetent, The Intersections of Race and Class for Women in Academia. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we're often punished for leading, as Shirley Moody Turner points out in her recent Washington Post article on Anna Julia Cooper, how the Black female head of a top DC school was punished for leading, right? So Anna Julia Cooper, of course, is credited with publishing the first book-length analysis of what's now called Black feminism in the United States with her book, A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South, which was published in 1892. So I say all of that to say the issues and questions around gender and race and leadership are not new. They've been going on for a long time. And again, at one end of the spectrum, I think we're acknowledged as good leaders and that leadership is exploited. At the other end of the extreme, there's a presumed incompetence, even when we're demonstrating strong leadership.
One of the whole points of this podcast, one of our objectives, one of our responsibilities is to raise awareness around issues that have been problems for a long time, but not always recognised. Could you tell us more about the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers? What do you do? How can it help address the historical and contemporary challenges that are faced by Black women in these positions today? And what do you see as your future?
Yes, so CBWP addresses the historical and contemporary challenges faced by Black women in leadership roles by unapologetically centering and celebrating Black women philosophers in all of our diversity and brilliance, right? So I founded CBWP in 2007 with encouragement from the late philosopher Charles Mills, and others when I was still an untenured assistant professor. So the inaugural conference was spotlighted in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Diverse Issues in Higher Education. And I wrote an article titled Being a Black Woman Philosopher, Reflections on Founding the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers, which was published in Hypatia, that also details my early work with this organization. But I will say, for our purposes here, at the time that I founded CBWP, the American Philosophical Association had over 11,000 members. And according to the APA Committee on Blacks in Philosophy, only about 112 of those members were Black, and only 20 of those were Black women across various ranks. So since then, and it's been about 2 decades since then, there are now approximately 50 Black women with doctorates of philosophy in the United States. So the numbers are still very low, but they have increased from the 20 that they were back when I founded CBWP. The initial vision and purpose for CBWP was to encourage and foster a networking and mentoring relationship between the marginalized and underrepresented Black women in philosophy, including undergraduate and graduate students, as well as professors across ranks, so assistant, associate, and full professors in the academy, and even those who chose to leave academia. So CBWP creates a positive space for participants to experience intellectual growth, mentoring, and professional development. And so while the remediation of low numbers of Black women in philosophy is a very important issue and has been for a long time, I do want to underscore the fact that CBWP is not and has never been merely a reaction to the lack of diversity in the race, as well as the race and gender bias that does in fact exist within the discipline and profession of philosophy in particular, and I would say in the academy more generally, right? So again, those are issues that need to be addressed, that CBWP has addressed, but the intention has never been only to address those issues. Rather, the intention has always been to build an intellectual community in which we unapologetically center and celebrate Black women philosophers, again, in all of our diversity and brilliance, and offer spaces where we can be philosophers and do philosophy as our whole selves without having to adjust ourselves or contort ourselves for others.
We absolutely need more Black women in philosophy, as we need more Black women in leadership across all spheres of society. Can you tell us, what is the role of philosophy in making sure that we are progressing and advancing towards this goal?
Yeah, so I think there is a role for philosophy. I think there's a role. Well, I want to think about this in terms of like how Black women choose to move in the world and what spaces we choose to move in the world, right? And so for me, I was really intentional about going into the discipline of philosophy. I often tell people, if I had not gone to a historically Black women's college, small liberal arts college, I probably would not have majored in philosophy if I had gone to a predominantly white institution. But because I went to a historically Black women's college, philosophy was taught in a way where I could see myself reflected in the philosophy, whether we were talking about somebody like Angela Davis or somebody like Kant, right? So any class that I took at Spelman College took seriously the intersections of things like race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, those kinds of questions, right? So I think we need to explore how philosophy gets taught. Spelman College is a place that has taught philosophy very well. It has been very intentional about centering certain kinds of questions in philosophy. So I think that's one starting point, is just how philosophy gets taught and how people get exposed to philosophy and what's helpful about it. But again, for me, I'm not a gatekeeper when it comes to philosophy. So I don't think you have to have a PhD in philosophy in order to be a philosopher or in order to be philosophical.
I think that's a really important answer. And thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm delighted to introduce our last guest, Divya Dwivedi. She's a philosopher and writer and a professor at the Indian Institute of Technology in New Delhi.
Divya, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our podcast. I would like to ask you our very first question. It's a very general one. What is leadership?
Let me start by saying what leadership is not, because this word is used so much in our times. Leadership is not dictating norms or declaring intentions, especially to a group or on behalf of a group. Ideally, leadership is, first of all, the most acute form of listening. Listening to those for whom one assumes responsibility. And so I think leadership needs to be defined in terms of these two terms I find very important: listening and taking responsibility. Leadership then is about paying attention to and thinking about the composition of concerns that people have, because the world is complex and concerns are interlinked. They don't come isolated. They cannot become individual agendas. Listening can allow a composition of concerns to emerge, and that means to create a shared experience which can take the form, this is what we want. And people who are at the forefront, whom we often call leaders, would be the ones who can then articulate this demand. This is what we want. And the second part of leadership is that it involves negotiation, because a composition of concerns requires the negotiation of multiple concerns of multiple people rather than simply representing oneself or one's own position.
So I think this is very important when we talk about gender equality and women's underrepresentation in leadership, or the underrepresentation of their concerns in maybe leaders' agendas. Given your expertise in philosophy and literature as well, your exploration of political thought and gender studies, have you perceived the emergence of new feminist perspectives in leadership to better address the concerns of all that maybe was not the case before?
If we keep in mind the negative definition of leadership as declaring intentions, dictating norms, then certainly we have had very dominant previous models of leadership. And the new feminist perspectives that are emerging are, first of all, diverse. There are different feminist articulations by women, from women in different parts of the world, and they, each of them, become different voices. But as we become more and more acutely aware of the challenges which are planetary in their scale and worldwide in their impact, whether it is climate change or global inequality, we realize the importance of this diversity of feminist perspectives. But philosophically speaking, at the core of the possibility of a new feminist idea of or understanding of leadership to emerge, I think we have to look back at the presence, the existence of women in the past and today. And there I have to say that the two-part definition of being at the forefront, one which is about listening and the other which is about negotiating, it shows us that women have perhaps always been leaders in the first sense, because they have been the best at listening. They have been listening for centuries. And yet, when it comes to the second part, women at the forefront have a tremendous disadvantage, because when they enter into the act of negotiation as a part of taking responsibility, they have to negotiate with men. And so we also perhaps can find models of women in leadership which are models in transition, because in negotiating with these previous models of leadership, women have also had to negotiate somewhat by playing through those roles. And that has given us iconic women leaders in the past and even today. What we also need to consider today is the meaning of what it means to lead. And that has to change in order for feminist perspectives on leadership or women leaders to become effective. So it's a double track on which women must come to the forefront of leadership.
This work of redefinition, I think this takes us to the publications that you've worked on in the past, one with UNESCO that is entitled Intellectuals, Philosophers, and Women in India, and another one more recently on Indian philosophy, Indian revolution, on caste and politics. Can you maybe tell us if you've seen changes since the publications, and if you could elaborate on how philosophical frameworks such as those can help us understand and deconstruct traditional gender roles and stereotypes which have been embedded in past and flawed notions of leadership?
The reality that we need to describe, analyze, and criticize has become more acute. And in that sense, we are now able to think more clearly about how urgent the need for this criticism is. What is philosophy's role with respect to this reality in my part of the world? To break the hermeneutics of the tradition as a preservation of that tradition against what is often called colonial epistemology? Or should philosophy, in fact, contribute to the creation of new freedoms and therefore contribute to politics as the fight for freedom, where philosophy must become also a material practice?
This is indeed an important part of your work, and you are the co-editor of Narratology and Ideology, Negotiating Context, Form, and Theory in Post-Colonial Contexts. How do narratives influence our understandings? How can they help us in, first, decolonizing traditional thought, and two, reshape traditional concepts of leadership in a modern feminist inclusive way?
So narratives do influence our understanding of leadership, but also our understanding of gender in the sense of today privileging the concerns of post-colonial women as compared to what is in a very cruel way called white women. I think we must be very cautious of these reductive new stereotypes of the decolonial position itself, because I don't think any individual and their polynomial possibilities can be restricted by these labels. New narratives, therefore, are still awaited, which can tell of the concerns, the sufferings, and the needs of a vast majority of the world, which is not yet part of the conversation. So our immediate challenge should be, is there a model of listening, negotiating, and forefronting people without exception, not reversing older binaries and hierarchies of power, but truly conceiving new models of sharing in all the well-being that we can together invent and imagine for each other. I do realize that having women icons is extremely important for girl children when they go to school and they realize that all the educational models that have been prepared for them at a given point leave them for only a few intended futures, and they are left out of imagining a role for themselves as leaders. On the other hand, I think of a woman leader from an even older time who has not found a place in the best-known chronicles of world history, Savitribai Phule, who was a lower caste woman, an educationist, an anti-caste intellectual and activist, who created institutions for education as well as asylum for women, for widows, for girl children of all castes, and truly therefore had a vision of liberating and emancipating all women without exception and all lower caste people without exception. This is a narrative that has not yet been told. I'm certain that there are countless such narratives of women leaders that have not been heard or represented in all parts of the world. Narratives definitely must change.
Thank you. This is a perfect ending, which leaves us with more questions than we came for. We're now leaving with more reflections to have. And this was a very good way to frame the podcast as we're moving forward with more guests. We can look into those narratives, those imaginations that we don't have yet, to build a new understanding of leadership.
I think it's great for our audience to not just come for answers, but also come with questions. And I know that in a future episode, we're going to be hearing from some of our listeners and getting some input and feedback from them. So I think this is a great opportunity to pose those questions to our listeners, and we'll certainly look forward to hearing from them in the future. Thank you for listening to this third episode of Leadership for Equality by UNESCO and ACWW.
This podcast on women thought leaders was recorded at UNESCO headquarters. It was produced and directed by Newland. It was co-hosted by Newland and Garance with the support of Camille, Guinet, Emmanuel Rudowski, and Juliette Solesse. Thank you, and see you soon.